Hey folks, we'll be ending our semester looking at a couple sections from chapter 4 all about exponents. So we're going to start with section 2, which is actually just named exponents. And as we talk about exponents, we're really talking about a simplified way of showing repeated multiplication. You can find this in your book, and I would encourage you to first read notes on page 178 and 179. And we call this number and its exponent. The whole thing is called a power. So you'll often hear these called powers. We have two parts here. The base is the number which is multiplied, and the exponent is how many times that number is multiplied by itself. In this case, we would say 2 to the 6th power means 2 times itself 6 times. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. As you can see, it's a much simpler way to write repeated multiplication. There's a great table in your book that outlines how we would read. Remember that we have to learn how to read mathematical symbols like this. A variety of different powers. Some have special cases, like 6 to the 2nd power can also be said 6 squared. When we have that number, that exponent 2, we are squaring something. Another thing to note in that table, -7 to the 4th, is that we are going to talk about how we follow order of operations. We first take the exponent. This is the opposite of 7 to the 4th power. Whereas the parentheses around -8 to the 5th power mean that the base of this exponent is actually negative, whereas the base of this exponent was positive. And our first example shows us how we can write repeated multiplication as a power. The second example shows how we could simplify an exponent. For instance, -7 to the 4th is the opposite of 7 to the 4th power. We would multiply those 7s together and then take the opposite of that. -8 to the 5th power would be -8 times itself 5 times. Now let's think, if we were to multiply these first two together, a negative times a negative is a positive, that's right. And a positive times a negative is a negative. Negative times a negative is a positive, and a positive times a negative is a negative. We have to pay attention to how many times. We'll get to some more examples like that, but let's start with example 1. Example 1 has us rewrite using exponents. So for our first example, -5 times -5 times -5. Well, when we write the power, we need to know what is the base and what is the exponent. The base is the number that's being multiplied by itself. In this case, the base is -5. And how many times is it being multiplied by itself? 1, 2, 3. Exponent. So our power is the base as a full large number. Notice, since the base is -5, I put parentheses around that base. And the exponent is called a superscript. It's a small number up to the right-hand corner. Why don't you try one? Let's try another one. This is example 1a. Example 1b, -2 times a times b times a times a. Well, when we write a number as a power, it has to have the same base. These factors in example 1b are not all the same. We can rearrange them since this is multiplication. Our property of multiplication says that I can rearrange this The commutative property says I can rearrange. And then I can pick which numbers I want to multiply together first. And why might I do this? Well, because now I have a base A multiplied by itself 1, 2, 3 times. When I simplify that, -2 doesn't change, but I can write that A times A times A as A to the third times B. And I've simplified what I can and left the other factors, -2 and B. So it'd be a good chance to try quick check 1. Go ahead and you can pause your video and try that. I'll put the answer up in a second. Okay, if you've tried quick check 1, if you haven't, pause and try it. A is 6 times itself 3 times, or 6 to the third. And quick check 1b is 4 times x times y to the second, because that y is multiplied by itself twice. You might wonder why I put the x first and the y second. We typically put those variables in alphabetical order. I did the same thing here, A and then B. Now let's look at example 2. We've moved to page 179. Example 2 says, how can I rewrite this? Or another way to say that would be simplify it. A microscope can magnify a specimen 10 to the third times. How many times is that? So we have a power. We want to know, what is that number in standard form? It's just a typical number. Well, we know 10 to the third is 10 times itself 3 times. I could pull out my calculator, or I could use, for some products, we could even do this in our head. 10 times 10 is 100, times 10 is 1,000, times 10 times 10. I can check that on my calculator, and it is 1 with 3 zeros here, or 1,000. I can't always do that in my head, but sometimes I can. Quick check 2. A says simplify 7 squared. So go ahead and try that. Rewrite it as a product and then multiply. What do we get? Pause and try. Quick check 2A. All right, if you got 49, that is correct. And B says evaluate the opposite of A to the fourth and -A to the fourth when A is 2. When we evaluate, that means we plug in a number and we simplify. If you recall, long time ago when we evaluated, every time we see a variable we're plugging in, we replace that with parentheses. Now, if I simplify this, just like before, that negative sign is outside. The base of this is 2. So I first need to find what is 2 to the fourth power. And then I'll take the opposite. 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. I could do that one at a time, or I could use my calculator. Is 16. So this is the opposite of 16, or -16. And just to check that, I can plug that straight into my calculator. Negative is the bottom corner button, 2, and then this right on the right-hand side, this up arrow gives me a chance to plug in my exponent. -2 to the fourth is -16. This other example, and -2 to the fourth. Okay, now let's keep track of these parentheses, because I replaced A with parentheses and I put in a 2. But now I have to look at what's inside the parentheses. That is the base of my power. Well, negative and 2 are the opposite of 2. So my base is -2. That means I am multiplying -2 by itself 4 times. If I try that in my calculator, -2 times -2 times -2 times -2, I get, can you see it? Positive 16. Well, wait, these are slightly different. Notice whether there's parentheses or not makes a difference. And we can check that in our calculator as well. If there are parentheses here in the example, I also need to put them in my calculator. Parentheses, -2, end parentheses, to the up arrow, fourth power is positive 16. And finally, we can use the power within the order of operations. So this will be example 3. And if you remember, our order of operations when we are simplifying is GEMDAS. And we've spent a lot of time with that: multiplication, division, addition, and subtraction. We've even spent some time with grouping symbols. This is what we're using today, is the exponents. That E stands for exponents. Ooh, a little hard to write that in that little space, but it comes second in our order of operations. So keep that in mind as we look at some of these examples here today. In our order of operations, we're going to first simplify anything in grouping symbols, then simplify exponents, then multiply, divide, then add and subtract. So our first example, this is example 3, part A, has 4 parentheses, 3.7 plus 2, end parentheses to the second power. One step at a time. Order of operations says the first step I do is anything in grouping symbols. So I look for 3.7 plus 2. 3.7 times 2 is 5.7. Now that's simplified to the second power. Next is exponents. So what is to the second power? What is the base? Well, let's see if we can add something in here or put something explicitly that was implied. That 4 parentheses really means 4 times. Well, multiplication comes after exponents, so I'm first going to do my 5.7 base to the second power. I'm going to get out my calculator for this, clear everything here. 5.7 to the second power. Oh, forgot to look. 32.49. So 4 times 32.49. And finally, I can multiply 4 times 32.49, which is 129.96. And we follow the order of operations. You can also check out how we could use this to evaluate. You plug in numbers and you replace them with parentheses. This is example 3b. -2x to the third plus 4y. When we have an x value, replace x with parentheses and plug in 2. Replace y with parentheses and plug in 3. And now again, we follow our order of operations. We look inside parentheses. Anything to simplify? Nope, those are already simplified. Next is exponents. And again, the 4 parentheses is 4 times and -2 times. So first, I need to do my exponent, 2 to the third power. I can plug that into my calculator. 2 to the third power is 8. I have multiplication, and I usually work from left to right. So -2 times 8 is -16 plus 4 times 3. -16 plus 4 times 3 is 12. And finally, I add these together. And my answer is -4. As you get ready to practice, our assignment is listed on RenWeb and on Moodle. Make sure you come back to these examples to see if they can help as you go through some of those practice problems. Thanks, guys, for watching through this whole video. Have a great time doing math.